curator and museum director for Bellingrath Gardens and Home. A lot of people may not realize that this property started out as a fishing camp back in 1918 for Walter Bellingrath. Walter Bellingrath was a native of Atlanta, but he had grown up in Castleberry, Alabama. And his older brother discovered that Coca-Cola was offering franchises to bottle their product. Before that time, you had to go to a soda fountain. So in 1903, Walter Bellingrath moved to Mobile and started the Mobile Coca-Cola Bottling Company. He was a one-man operation at that point because he had to come up with the money to buy the franchise and had little left over for any other employees. And lucky for us, he ended up with a secretary a couple years later, Bessie Morris, who he married in 1906. And it was Mrs. Bellingrath's idea to convert what had been Mr. Bellingrath's fishing camp into a garden. And it all started out because Mrs. Bellingrath was suspicious of what Walter Bellingrath was drinking down here in the afternoons. So she'd come down here unannounced about 5 o'clock to see what he and his buddies had been drinking. She could never catch him with more than a Coca-Cola. Now, once she started bringing garden flowers down here, she had a gardener from Mobile come down, and then hired an architect in 1927. That was George B. Rogers. George Rogers had been in Mobile for a good 20-some-odd years by that point, and as far as we know, this was the first real major garden he designed. There weren't any landscape architects in Mobile at that time. But George Rogers came down to dress up the camp, and he's the one that created all the water features that we know now, the rockery and the waterfall of the river and the Mirror Lake, which was completely man-made. All these things were things that George Rogers thought of, although the rockery was really Mrs. Bellingrath's idea. Now, the house came later because the original property was just 2 cabins. One had a couple of bedrooms and a bathroom. The other was the kitchen and dining room. Now, the lodge, the one with the living room, was enlarged in the 1920s, but they still had a separate building for their meals. Well, in 1932, things were looking so good that they decided to open it to the public on a Sunday afternoon in April. So that Sunday afternoon in 1932, they put an ad in the paper and invited people to come out and look at Bellingrath Gardens, or what was still called Bell Camp at that point. 4,700 people showed up that Sunday afternoon. And they were so astounded that that many people had an interest in gardens, they decided to make it a public attraction. But the idea at first was just to have it open in the springtime to look at the camellias and the azaleas, and once the azaleas were through, they had thought we'd have to close the gardens and have it our private place after that for the summer. Well, that didn't work. People kept coming year-round, and they decided to make it a year-round attraction in 1934. And once they were down here, they realized those 2 little cabins, well, were just not winterized and wasn't someplace you want to live year-round. So they tore one of them down in 1935 and built the Bellingrath home, which has 10,500 square feet and 15 rooms. Now, we can tell from photographs that the home they had on Ann Street in Mobile, which had been their full-time residence, was furnished entirely with new furniture when they bought it around 1912. All furniture made in the United States, probably in Grand Rapids, very good quality furniture, but there are no antiques visible in the photographs we have of those interiors. When Mrs. Bellingrath built this house, she had the antique bug like so many other Americans with wealth. She wanted antique furniture, and that's what she started buying. And she bought it from individuals as well as the best antique dealers in New Orleans. Now, this was all being done with checks payable to cash. Mr. Bellingrath was notoriously thrifty, or we should say cheap. In fact, when he was looking at this property back in 1918, it had come available. We still don't know what the purchase price was, but whatever it was, he told everyone he came across in Mobile that it was too much money, he couldn't afford it. And people started avoiding him because they got tired of hearing about this wonderful fishing camp, that the property is the highest on the river, the water's brackish, you can get out in Mobile Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. There's nothing like it available. He just couldn't afford it, it's just too much money. Well, luckily for us, he happened to go to his physician with some kind of ailment, and at the end of the exam, after he'd been talking about this fishing camp nonstop, he asked the doctor what was wrong with him. And the doctor looked him in the eye and said, "You need to learn how to play." He said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well, you need to learn to play, have a good time, buy that fishing camp down, find wherever you're talking about, and enjoy yourself." So that's what he did in 1918. In fact, that doctor was my grandfather that told him that. And Mr. Bellingrath, for the rest of his life, could always say, "Well, I never would have spent the money, but my doctor told me to do it." So meanwhile, Mrs. Bellingrath is furnishing the house that comes 20-some-odd years later with all these beautiful antiques and very expensive shops in New Orleans, writing all her checks to cash. Now, her nephew, Ernest Edgar Jr., told me that he was working for Coca-Cola for his uncle and working and running the bookkeeping department. And he said, "Tom, it was my job to maintain Aunt Bessie's checking account. If she was overdrawn, they called me. They didn't call Uncle Bill, even though Mr. Bellingrath was on the board of First National Bank." So he came into Ernest's office one day and shut the door, and he thought to himself, uh-oh, this is never good when he shuts the door. And he said, Ernest, I know you handle your aunt's checking account. I want to know right now what she paid for such and such. And he, for some reason, he couldn't remember the exact item that he was curious about, but there are plenty in this house to look at that he might be the one. And Ernest said, I had to tell him, Uncle Bill, I have to tell you, Aunt Bessie said to tell you if you ever ask me that question. He looked very surprised and he said, what? He said, go ask her. And he could see the steam come out of his ears. He got up and walked out of the room, and a few days later, when he saw his aunt, he said, Aunt Bessie, Uncle Bill wanted to know what she paid for such and such. And she looked kind of surprised and said, oh, what did you tell him? And then she smiled and nodded. She said, very good. That's funny, she said. He hasn't said a word to me about it. So they had a very interesting relationship. So when you walk through this house, all 15 rooms, all the original furnishings are here. Everything, by and large, has a good story behind it. So Mrs. Bellingrath was happily buying antiques for this house, writing all those checks to cash. And again, she was paying some pretty high prices, but these were her friends. They had been good to her. They put things aside that they wouldn't sell to other people, knowing that she was going to pay full price. And so she helped keep a lot of them in business during some pretty lean years in the 1930s. Well, Mrs. Bellingrath got the house beautifully furnished the way she wanted it, and then she got ill. She had cancer issues, high blood pressure. She unfortunately got all the bad genes in her family. And she died at the age of 64. That was in February of 1943. Now, Mr. Bellingrath had a decision to make after getting those letters of paying for everything. He could have shut the gardens down at that point. The gardens had been operating at a loss every year since they'd opened in 1932. The ticket sales at the gate had never paid for the expenses. And as tight as he was, or frugal, we should say, he could have shut the operation down and said, you know, this is Mrs. Bellingrath's joy. It's not mine. I'm not a gardener. So Walter Bellingrath created the Bellingrath Mortgage Foundation when he was 80 years old, dedicated to Mrs. Bellingrath. He said, we are to maintain this house and property as a fitting and we are to maintain the gardens at home as a fitting and permanent memorial to Mrs. Bellingrath, and that's what we attempt to do. So we try to keep the house just the way she had it. With her antiques are here, the stories behind them, and the stories about the Bellingraths. So that's why it's always a pleasure to take guests through this home, because it's unlike most historic homes that you go through the United States that may have had 3 and 4 generations of different families that own the property. This is the story of one couple, their love for each other, and the beauty they created. But I'd like to thank the University of South Alabama for filming this, for making it a permanent part of their collections. We'd love to have you come see us at Bellingrath. We can always be reached by our website, www.bellingrath.org, and we are open year-round, every day of the week.